Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in Puerto Rico going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. The first chart shows total filings by year since 1990 in Puerto Rico. If you can see that from 1990 to 1995, filings were running around 7,000 or 8,000 per year. This more than doubled by 1999, which was actually the peak year in the state, to up to almost 18,000. Dropped off a little bit in the coming years, and a big decline in 2006. Filings increased quite a bit, more than doubled back by 2010, and then have been fairly flat in recent years. And this is actually a very different pattern than you see in any of the 50 states. Nearly every state had their peak year in 2005, which was the year of bankruptcy reform. And so filings were generally quite a bit higher that year than any other year. The 2010 generally got the increases from 2006 to 2010 were much more pronounced, and the declines since 2010 have also been more pronounced in every other state. But looking at where Puerto Rico is now, filings are about where they were back in 1996, quite a bit above where they were in 1990, even though most states are right about where they were in 1990, and somewhat lower than they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. This map shows filings relative to population, by state and for DC and Puerto Rico. The yellow-colored places have the lowest bankruptcy rates and more than 25% below average, and at 28% below Puerto Rico's 16th lowest among the states and district here. Looking at it year by year, you can see that in the early 1990s, Puerto Rico the bankruptcy rate was about 30% below average. By 1999, it actually was above the national average, and it has been then fell well below it again for a number of years, but for the last 2 years they've been above average again. So even though over time Puerto Rico has been well below average in the bankruptcy filing rate, there have been several years and several periods where the rate has been higher than average. Looking at Chapter 7 cases by year, in the early 1990s, there were around 1,500 filed in Puerto Rico, with a rapid rise in the late 1990s to over 5,000. It settled down to around 4,000 to 4,500 from 2000 2005. Big drop-off in 2006, a run-up with the recession to around 4,000, and been fairly stable the last couple of years at around 4,000, 4,500 per year. Looking at Chapter 11 filings in Puerto Rico, you can see the big drop-off throughout the 1990s, and this is very typical of almost every state. Then a period of running at about 125 per year in the early 2000s, and then filings have been running about 200 per year since 2011. And this is also a very unusual pattern in that most places filings have dropped by at least half since 2009, and are much lower now than they were back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But with Puerto Rico and the economic situation there, Chapter 11 activity is quite high there. And it looks like it'll be even higher in 2016, probably between 250 and 300 cases. Looking at Chapter 13 cases per year, you can see that from 1990 to 1995, we're running around 6,000 a year. This doubled by 1999, and then since then has dropped off quite a bit, particularly after bankruptcy reform. And even with the recession, Chapter 13s are well below where they were back prior to reform, and have dropped back down now to pretty comparable to where they were back in the early 1990s in the state. Most in Puerto Rico, most states the rate is quite a bit higher than it was in 1990. Now, looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s, the national average has been right around 30% per year for a number of decades, with some disruption around bankruptcy reform. In Puerto Rico, in the early 1990s, the rate was around 75%, which was the highest in the country, and stayed at least 70% through around 2010. Since then, it's dropped somewhat. Has now dipped below 60%. And is getting closer to the national average, but still Chapter 13s are quite high in Puerto Rico relative to total filings. Now, this chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Puerto Rico compared to the United States average, and you can see that Puerto Rico has been very high every quarter since 2006. Most years around. Most of the time around 12-13%. The national got up to nearly 10% throughout during the Great Recession, 2009-2010, but now has fallen down to around 5%. Puerto Rico is still above 11%, and this probably even understates the situation because there's very low labor force participation in Puerto Rico, and for the people who are employed, the incomes are really quite low relative to any of the 50 states. Now, filings most recently nationwide peaked in September 2010 and have fallen by 49% since then. The largest declines have been in the Northeast, particularly New England, and in the Southwest, and in California and Nevada, the filings are down by more than 70% since their peak. In Puerto Rico, filings have only fallen 10% during this time, and that is far less than any other state. Throughout the Southeast, the declines tend to be in the 30 to 40% range, but with Puerto Rico, they've only had a very small decline over time. Looking at it quarter by quarter, you can see that in Puerto Rico, the blue columns here, they had periods of nearly average declines. 2013-14 filings were up, and you've kind of got an unclear pattern with filings are up and down a little bit. Nationwide, filings, the declines were running 10 to 15% every quarter for about 5 years, and the rate of decline is slowing down now. So far in the first 6 months of 2016, filings nationwide have declined by about 6%, where they're up in Puerto Rico around 5%. And you can see that the states colored red here are all showing increases, where if we just looked at this a year or two ago, there would have been virtually no red anywhere because everyone was going down. But now about 12, 15 states are actually showing increases right now. In Puerto Rico in the third quarter, filings were kind of flat compared to the same quarter last year. I think this year there'll be about 11,500 cases filed. Increases in the coming year. Probably Puerto Rico will return to the 15,000 per year level that it had from, say, 1997 to 2005. And I'm not predicting any other state to return to their pre-bankruptcy reform levels, but with Puerto Rico, I think given the economic situation there and just where things seem headed. Filings could reach record levels. And so that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Puerto Rico. For more statistical information and information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.